11 plus years of Islandora and Drupal experience. And for a quick background about Discovery Garden, we were founded in 2010 out of the Islandora project at UPI. We helped found the Islandora Foundation in 2013. Then, as you can kind of see, we performed a whack of installations for a lot of clients. So, going to go over a quick agenda for today. We're going to talk about approaching migrations from a process perspective. What is Drupal Migrate and why use it? DGI Migrate and its ecosystem. We're going to do a scary live demo and then talk about future improvements in tuning Drupal for migrations if we have time. I know there's a mixture of technical and non-technical people on the call, so the intention is to stay out of the weeds technically until we get to the demo portion. There's a lot of content to cover in this, so there should be some time at the end for questions, but we'll have to play it by ear on that. So just to get started then, talking about migration process. So when we kind of approach a migration, and this is very much agnostic to say Islandora or doing stuff in Drupal, what we normally do first is assess the current system, which includes reviewing existing data, as well as exporting that data, gathering provision requirements, and then building the actual migration process, which can be broken down a little bit more into data modeling, getting the sample data, and then testing and iteration. So we're going to go through these a little bit more in depth. So the first thing that we typically do, we generate what would be considered more like a data survey document as well as a mapping document. But to start out, you really want to know what your current format that your data is in. So that includes your metadata. So, what metadata schemas are you leveraging? Are they uniform? Are they variant? Do you not know? How are those binary assets stored? Are they with the metadata? Are they in some other complete other system? And, if it's possible, being able to get all of your data and kind of running, XPaths or other tooling to get all occurrences of unique elements and values will really help narrow down this process. Other things to consider would be what needs to be retained from the previous system. So, for example, are premise and CRUD events meaningful? I know during the last Islandora open call, Alan Stanley kind of mentioned that he hasn't ran into scenarios where they are. And so far, that's kind of been our experience as well. But this is something that you need to kind of consider when you're migrating out of a system. Can your existing assets be reused? So can your thumbnail derivatives be used in a meaningful way in the new system? If they can, you can potentially save yourself some processing time by not needing to rederive them. Other things to be aware of: do user accounts need to be migrated? Preferably, most institutions use SSO these days or single sign-on. But if they don't, do you have to move those things across? And then lastly, are there any security restrictions in place? So do you have restricted access like XACML in the Islandora sense, or do you have embargoes that you have to ensure get applied on the other end? And this is by no means exhaustive. This is kind of just tip of the iceberg of things to consider. And then from that point, you get into exporting your existing data. So, how do you get your content out? And I've laid out some of the more common tools or ecosystems in our space. So CDM stores things in a specific metadata format that can be transformed on output to various mappings. The issue with that is those mappings can vary per collection. So it can be very arduous to kind of go through and make sure you have everything and everything can be mapped in a uniform way. DSpace exports in a METS wrapper with QDC elements inside. It's actually decently nice to work with. Digital Commons doesn't have a discernible endpoint the last time I checked. So the only avenue that people have suggested would be harvesting via OAI PMH and custom parsing on top of that, which could be flat and it can be lossy, not really ideal. FC Repo and /Islandora has a myriad of ways, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then obviously bespoke systems are the most scary because you don't necessarily know how they're built unless you had a hand in implementing the system. It might just be a black box. Moving along then, getting into provisioning requirements. So you want to determine kind of your target metadata goal. So documenting any known issues that may need to be addressed during the migration. It's easier to fix these in the pre-migration phase than the post. So realistically, kind of your metadata survey where you are generating the list of all your values and say all of your subjects and entities and things like that would really help drive this and figure out if you have to normalize. There is some ramifications if you choose to do things in the post-migration phase. So in a Drupal Migrate-esque scenario, if you were doing like iterative runs or rollbacks, your post-migration changes are going to get stomped. So it's not ideal. During this process, it's also an ideal time to evaluate your current workflow. Since you are making a potentially major change to a new system, you might be able to streamline your process and have less stakeholder pushback to these changes because you're already kind of undertaking it. Other things to consider is identifying gaps in functionality between the new system and old, and figuring out if those gaps are really deal breakers for acceptance. So for example, did your old system watermark web accessible content? Or in the more Islandora specific scenario, does your Islandora 7 content model exist in its current form in Islandora 2 Plus? So I know there's ongoing work, I believe, at Born Digital and other places, but the easy example here would be like oral histories, or if you're using TI-based metadata, things like that. And then lastly, content display. For this, you really want to leverage existing work as much as possible. And at least in the Islandora realm, it's become a lot easier to do that because there's a lot of contrib modules that do kind of provide these things and Islandora core itself. So reducing your need for custom development. And then determining a cutoff date. So when will your data be exported for ingest in the new system? You also kind of want to determine if that cutover is going to be all at once or if it's a phased approach. If you do choose to go in a phased approach, it puts less pressure on you to complete the migration all in one shot because the old system can kind of live side by side. You can determine a time when you're going to just update your domain or DNS and off you go. You also then have to decommission your old system. At that point, you do want to update all your persistent identifiers like handles, DOIs, and URL redirects, like I had mentioned, and decide on your tentative go live because it will potentially dictate migration approaches if you do have a hard deadline because of donor funding or any other kind of extraneous circumstances. Not directly related, but something to keep in mind as well would be your system or hardware considerations. So if you are dealing with large source files, are you storing them locally? If you are storing them locally, do you have enough disk space? Are you going to push them out to an external service? How many objects do you have, and how far and quickly do you expect to grow for similar reasons? Something that you can do or keep in mind when you're going through migration processes is that you can allocate additional resources just for the migration and scale it back down after. And that becomes more of a consideration, something that you might want to do if you're talking about generating like a load of derivatives and you're not retaining them from the old system because it's additional processing power required as you're ingesting these objects. So yeah, again, talking about the migration build process. So you want to create your data model, and that's mapping the content from the old system to the new. Historically, we've kind of used a MIME type mapping for binaries if that's required. You also need to kind of map your relationships to the equivalent in the new system. So for example, content DM nested compounds can become a collection with subcollections, or for a more Islandora specific example, your is member of and is member of collection kind of map to field member of. With Islandora 7 migrations in particular, you do need to create a content type representative of the data being migrated. And for those of you new to kind of this process, there is no one size fits all. The starter site is probably the best starting point for this right now, for you to at least kind of build off and see what a lot of the greater community thinks is best practices. And that's a hat tip to Rosie and everyone else that's contributed to that. And then, of course, you also have to make a content model mapping between Islandora 7 and Islandora 2 Plus. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, does an equivalent content model exist for everything you're migrating? And in the event that it doesn't, how are you going to handle that? So, do you have works? Are you just going to store those as binary? Or if you have a whole repository, it may make you reassess what might need to get done before you do a migration. So moving on to testing and iteration of the migration process, you ideally want to work with as big of a subset as feasible. If you can, using the entire data set would be the most preferable. Honestly, I personally prefer to at least have all the metadata in place because that tends to be where you'll run into your outliers and kind of edge cases that you may not expect, especially when you're crafting like a migration of a ton of rows and objects. You also need to determine your verification criteria for acceptance. And it's not going to be feasible to manually verify every object unless it's a very small collection that you're migrating and you have a lot of in-house knowledge about what you expect to be there and everything else. So ideally, you want to automate or iterate through this. And in terms of just iteration of a migration process in general, it's going to be always part of this. You're always going to identify a problem, you're going to want to fix it and run it again. So maybe it's a field that you didn't originally map. Maybe you had a typo. Maybe a stakeholder suddenly realizes that they want a piece of metadata that you didn't move across. The kind of scenarios are pretty limitless. So I'm going to talk now about Drupal Migrate. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Drupal Migrate is a core Drupal module defining an ETL process to get content into Drupal. It's broken down into a source, process, and destination phase, and those map directly to extract, transform, and load. Though given the ability for Drupal to run updates, it can also be looked at as an ELT process, so the loading becomes for the transform. Migrations are denoted in YAML, and they live as the definition of the migration, and it heavily utilizes the Drupal plugin API, so it allows modules to define their own custom actions as needed. So Migrate, Islandora, and other Drupal contrib modules have existing plugins that can be leveraged inside your migration definition. And not to put the cart before the horse, that's a lot of what DGI Migrate is going to be providing. It also supports high watermarks, which allows for iterative runs and only updates entities that have changed. And you can also do migration rollbacks. So the thing to note with rollbacking is it can be potentially very destructive depending on how your migration is defined. This line item is very much from experience. Migrate likes to delete file entities when you roll back. If your file entities happen to be the things you're processing, it's going to delete them off a disk. So make sure if you're doing stuff like this, it's read-only. In my demo, it's very much common as such. It's also common in the README. Buyer beware on that end. So talking now about DGI Migrate, it's a set of modules that exist to facilitate migration from Islandora 7 instances to Islandora 2 Plus. We've been developing this for the last 3+ years as more clients of ours and clients of the community are migrating. For reference, we're currently in the process of migrating a client that has 4 million objects and 320 million triples. We've completed clients that have over 100,000 objects and obviously smaller than that as well. The cleanup of the code, documentation, open sourcing has been sponsored by FLVC and CTDA, and we're very grateful for that. In general, it provides helpers, wrappers, plugins that can be leveraged. And a key point with this is while today I'm going to be talking about FOXML-based migrations because that's the Islandora 7 step-off point for a lot of people, the tooling that's here can be used for any XML-based system. So there is a sample migration inside of DGI Migrate that's using DSpace as its source. So it's just processing XML. So something to keep in mind there. So this is a breakdown of effectively the major submodules of DGI Migrate. So we have the DGI Migrate devel module, which just provides some development tooling. We have paragraph generation for paragraph entities, EDTF validation for handling date validation and constraints that the normal EDTF constraint can't handle. We also have a DSpace migration and a FOXML migration. And then it also ships with some performance modules. So we have big set overrides, which handles dealing with long-running migrations and making sure that they run okay and they don't consume memory, as well as ImageMagick cleanup, which makes sure ImageMagick doesn't fill disks as it runs. There's also additional plugins beyond what's listed here, but we won't get into them too particular because there's quite a few of them, but you can see them in GitHub as you look at the code. So they exist for executing X paths and dealing with the type relation fields in Islandora and so on. It also defines a set of drush commands and shell scripts for managing migrations, but I'll touch more on that during the demo portion. So quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar, FOXML is Fedora Object XML, and it's basically the format that FC Repo 3 used to describe their objects that are being stored. And I'll pull one up very quickly here in Oxygen. So this is an example object we're going to migrate later, but it's effectively an XML wrapper with a bunch of properties, including data streams and so on. So why we approach things from a FOXML side is the source of truth is the old repository itself. It allows for a lossless mapping of the data and allows for hierarchical-based structures to be retained. And what I mean by that, just going back to Oxygen here, so by parsing the XML directly, we're able to keep the context of parent and child nodes together. So on the Drupal side of things, if you want to model this, and if you're using a flat source like of Solar, you can't necessarily retain like exactness to say like, okay, I do have this subject or an LCTGM subject, but I want to make sure these things are captured and stay together in the new system. A flat structure won't be able to kind of support that. So that's a big driver for us as well. You can also parse the audit trail. So those would be the premise and CRUD events I mentioned earlier. Versions can be restructured as required. It's not something that we do and won't be something I'm demoing today, but the FOXML does contain them. So you could technically recreate your versions as you do this. Something that I will show off today is the original FOXML can be created and stored within Drupal, which is nice if you're doing iterative runs or if you need something for historical sake. And a big thing for us as well is it lets you reference source XML data as XML. And particularly at DGI, our developers and metadata technicians are able to write XPaths and XLTs, and that's what they're comfortable with from years of doing this. So we're able to kind of integrate that into our migration process to make sure we are migrating the correct things across. So before I get into the demo, the last two things I'll talk about here are the FOXML and Akubra adapter modules. These are also open source and available on GitHub. So the FOXML module provides a source plugin and a way to parse a FOXML file as a Drupal Migrate process plugin. It parses FOXML directly, so the entire file is never loaded into memory, which is a pretty big deal. Originally, when we had designed this module as a prototype, we were using archival-based FOXML, which base64 encodes binaries, and they're incredibly large, and it would make PHP obviously boom. So making sure we're not loading in the entire thing at once is very desirable. The other thing it provides is a FOXML stream wrapper to kind of support that iterative parsing, but it also opens up some additional things, which I'll show off during the demo as well. And then lastly, we have an Akubra adapter module. Akubra was the name of the file system structure that FCrepo 3 used, and this allows us to access data from that structure. So in a migration context, we can mount the old Fedora data read-only and use that as our source XML files for doing a migration, which saves us a lot of time for not having to export data or have to copy data around the different systems and so on. So moving on now to a scary live demo. So for this demo, what I'm going to attempt to do, if everything goes well, is take this Cookie Monster collection I have on an Islandora 7 box, and then take all of the FOXML and move it into my empty Drupal 9 box here. So this has, I think, like 11 objects or so of varying different types of content. My local box is incredibly slow, so while that spins, I'll continue on. So you kind of see I have a compound, a few images, a book. These are all Cookie Monster images generated with Midjourney for the basis of this demo. So to get into the code portion of this, probably the easiest way to talk about this is just diving into the migrations themselves. So this is an Islandora open migrate module. It's on our GitHub, it's open, it's linked to in the slides, so you can look at this later. But the intent of this is to be a pretty simple, in a lot of air quotes here, example of how to use our plugins and things that DGI Migrate provides to do a migration. So we're only going to be migrating about 5 fields here. But if you want a more kind of padded out example, you could look at the DGI FOXML standard mods like implementation, which is the migration that we tend to build and use off ourselves. So there's a lot more depth there. So kind of just getting into migration YAML, the easiest way to kind of take this back to what I was talking about is you have your 3 source, destination, and process keys. In this case, we're using the FOXML plugin, like I had mentioned. And there is some setup for this on the box. And just for the sake of brevity, I've skipped a few steps, but the README has it all laid out what you need to do to kind of get this stuff set up. So we're going to be using FOXML as our source. The initial migration, what we're going to be doing is taking the original FOXML file and storing it within Drupal so we can process it. So we're making a Drupal file entity. And for the most part here, this is fairly boilerplate in the sense of we're setting like the created and changed properties, a status, a MIME type, and then setting the URI itself from the file. For those of you not super familiar with YAML, anything with an underscore would be considered an internal property, so it doesn't get set on the object. So the outcome of after running this migration would be we have a Drupal file entity that is the FOXML. So I know we went straight into the weeds really quick, but hopefully we can work through this and you'll see the outcome and maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. So moving on then, what we get into next is the node migration. And this tends to be the absolute meat of these migrations for the most part. Creating the file entities, like with the FOXML itself, and then creating, say, like the original files or what would have been the OBJs in 7 tend to be fairly standard and boilerplatey because, at least for Islandora 7 migrations, these things won't change. Everything will be in the OBJ. You're going to need to make a media and an original file, or sorry, a file and a media of those things and link them together. So for the most part, these things don't change super often. What ends up changing is this nodes migration. So for this, the source of the migration is the other migration that we just will run, which is all those FOXML files. We do kind of have some crazy YAML looking wizardry here. And it's not as crazy as it looks, but effectively, we're just defining some things that we're going to reuse as anchors. So just to dry up our process, we can refer to this chunk of YAML as base mods nodes. Once we use it down below, don't have to repeat ourselves over and over again. So getting to the destination then, we're going to be making a Islandora object node, and we want to validate these entities. And this is pretty important in my opinion. You may be tempted to set that to false just to get your content in. But if you go into the repository after the fact and want to edit those objects, and you try and save them, you're going to run into an issue potentially where you have fields with values that aren't valid, and you'll have to update all those things before you can save the object. So getting into the meat of the nodes migration, what we'll kind of see then is we're loading up our FOXML, and we want to get the Islandora 7 models off of it. And we also want to use the label. So when we're talking about this, one of the exported records that I have here is this FOXML file in Oxygen. So we're kind of just mapping out the FOXML properties and putting them to Drupal fields that make sense. So obviously the label is going to be our title, as well as just leveraging the existing, dates. Moving along, we are also using the state, and Fedora 3 had 3 defined states of active, inactive, and deleted, and we're just mapping this to the published field or state in Drupal. So if it was active, it stays active. Anything else, it stays inactive, so people can review it before it hits the repository and it's published. What we also provide here as well is a field PID. This is used so you can identify like the old field of your Islandora 7, because there's no direct one-to-one correlation of Drupal 7 PIDs to Islandora 2 plus NIDs. This is very important for when you're reviewing your data or if you're trying to handle like redirects or updates. One thing I failed to mention earlier, so all the fields that we're using in this sample migration here are also in the starter site, as far as I know. They're defined the same when I checked and everything else. So while I am running this on kind of a DGI-based dev box, this should be able to be run on whatever environment that you have. So continuing on then, we have kind of our content model mapping to resource types, as well as models, I suppose, actually. Pardon my nomenclature misnomer there. So we're mapping all occurrences of our Islandora 7 content models to their Islandora 8 equivalents. If something doesn't like match here, it's going to just bypass that row and not attempt to ingest it because it is a requirement. So what you'll see when we go to run this is I exported the entire Fedora from that sample site that I had, and it's including content models and things like that we don't care to retain because they're fairly meaningless. So they'll just skip them in the flow of the migration. So we're going to set the field model. So when I talked earlier about plugins and other modules providing plugins, DGI Migrate here provides a required entity lookup plugin, which wraps Hora's plugin, but effectively we're going to go look at the Islandora models taxonomy and match, these URIs from earlier to ensure that we get the correct entity reference. So if you were to go like create an object through the UI and go look at the fields, what's actually stored isn't like schema.org/digital document. It's a term ID for the vocabulary. So this just kind of handles all that for you while letting you kind of parse in or pass in text and going to look up the correct term from it. The display hints are just display hints. I'm not really going to talk about that. Moving along to the more nitty-gritty stuff now, we're going to start parsing the rels-ext or the relationship data from Islandora 7. So one of the plugins that we provide allows us to get at that on the FOXML. What's happening here in this giant, scary-looking chunk is effectively creating a DOM XPath, if you're familiar with that in PHP representation of the rels-ext. So we're grabbing actual portions of it out of the FOXML, and then we're registering the namespaces that we're going to use to make XPaths on it. So down below then, we're actually starting to query these things with XPaths as you expect. So RDF. And then once we have this Rails X node, we can start doing other XPaths on it. So we start by grabbing the isMemberOf and isMemberOf collection, as well as any compound relationships that exist with isConstituentOf. Similarly, we grab the amount of children that exist. This is primarily because Islandora 2 doesn't really have a mechanism to support objects that are members of multiple compounds. And if we encounter that, we want to make sure we don't attempt to ingest it and it's flagged so we can go review it and see if, we need to model things a little bit differently before the migration and so on. Also from the Rails X, we're grabbing sequence numbering for books as well as compounds, and that gets placed into our weight field. So this is a lot of YAML talking. Trust me, there'll be a payoff at the end of this, I promise. So moving along then, we'll get into the actual processing of the mods. It's very similar to the above where we're taking that giant FOXML node and grabbing the mods out of it. Similar process of registering the namespaces. But to get the actual mods node itself, we're taking mods 1, which for Islandora 7 folks is probably familiar looking in the sense that for mods records that have mods collection wrappers, we only really cared about the original mods element. So once we have that, we get into kind of mapping the rest of the metadata fields here. So field description. So this less than symbol is called a merge key in YAML, but it relates back to what I said earlier. So effectively, when this gets parsed, it's going to replace this merge key with base mods nodes. So the boilerplate of do this XML based query on the node given an XPath. So it's going to merge in the values we define as an override. So it's just for pure convenience sake and for making sure that we don't repeat ourselves. So in this case, we're getting all mods abstracts, taking the first value and mapping it to the field. And the rest here look very identical. So for field note, the same thing, query for mods physical description mods note. Resource type, once again, a little bit different. So we're going to grab the mods type of resource out of the record. But what we're going to end up doing here is because this is also a taxonomy term, at least in this content type, and this may need to get updated depending on Rosie's LOC term changes. Can't say that, didn't have them locally, so maybe I'll need to update this later. But effectively grabs the value out of the mods and then does a lookup on the resource types taxonomy term bundle and sets that value. The last kind of scary involved thing here before I'll go run this is field subject. So in all of my records, I have multiple topics defined. And when you kind of construct these fields in your migration definitions, you really want to make sure they match up and align directly to your content type. So things like cardinality, creating new terms, stuff like that really needs to be respected. So in this case, the decision for the content type and for this demo especially is that when we encounter any new values from my mod subject topic, we want to insert those into a taxonomy or reference the existing entity so we can use them later. So while there is an entity generate plugin, it's not ideal in the sense that if you go to roll back your migration, it won't know that it generated a bunch of terms. So as opposed to doing that, we are leveraging what's called stub migrations. So what ends up happening here for these other two merge key replacements, there's kind of a generic taxonomy terms migration here that exists, which pretty much creates terms for you. And then if it exists, it'll instead just reference what already exists and it won't create them. So this is just pure convenience. Like I said, for the most part, these just get repeated. There may be more particular ones for taxonomies that might have more custom fields defined. And like a good example of that would be type relation that has a bunch of I can't write the relators, I guess it would be, and other things of that nature. But effectively, we're still just generating taxonomy terms or referencing them here. And getting towards the end of this now, we're using the PID field that we defined earlier and also doing a stub migration to generate the actual node ID itself. So the reason why we're doing it like this is with Drupal Migrate, you can't necessarily guarantee the order that things are going to go in. So yes, you could probably set up your source plugin in a way that sorts it, but that's in itself not super ideal. So in a scenario where, say, your child object goes in before the parent, in order to keep these things consistent for field number of right underneath there, you want to make sure that you've generated a node ID for any kind of occurrence that you've ran into. So we use stub migrations in the same way to go create these entities. And this will also factor in if you had orphan objects in your Islandora 7. So when I say orphan objects, which sounds kind of out there, we basically just mean like any object that doesn't have parents like linked to it in the repository anymore. And it was fairly common to maybe do like a collection deletion. Maybe not all the children got deleted, or like a parent book object got deleted, not all the pages went. So you kind of have like a twofold thing you can do. You can try and assess these things pre-migration, or you can kind of deal with them post-migration. So as opposed to not ingesting these things at all, we'll create stub nodes that are unpublished and still retain all the other existing objects and their metadata, so you have a chance to review them. And then lastly, we see there's a few migration dependencies for this. So the nodes migration is dependent on the FOXML migration, the Islandora tags migration for the content modeling, and the stub nodes migration. There's a few other migration YAMLs here, mainly dealing with like original file and media, as well as storing the source FOXML. I'm not going to get into those just for the sake of time, because like I said, they're very boilerplatey. But if you do have questions about any of that stuff, feel free to reach out to me on Slack, or the issue queue I think is open on that repo, so we can always, have discussion there. So getting into actually like running this stuff now, after my giant blurb talking of YAML. So like I had kind of mentioned earlier in the slide deck, we also provide kind of a list of drush commands and shell scripts for just running these things as a way to kind of alleviate some of the pain points of the process that we've unraveled over time. So in terms of drush commands, like we have our own migrate import kind of wrapper that does everything in a batch context. So by default, migrate import, and this may have changed with drush, including these moving forward. I'd have to verify that. It's a fairly new version of drush that's done that, but they relied on the fact that you were going to be using like PHP in a CLI state where normally your memory limits are very, very high, if not unlimited. So that's not really ideal for a lot of these migrations on boxes. So we wrote it to leverage like Drupal batches so it can actually handle doing memory management and create new threads when it needs to, which did unravel a few other things that we've encountered with like migration bottlenecks and tooling, but I'll talk about that back in the slide deck. So with that, effectively to like run this, so, on this box, I have that Fedora data that I had like moved out of my old Islandora 7. It's a fixture in this repo, so you can use it and fire it and move it around. Instructions are in the README. But what we're going to do then is run a bash command, not the rollback because I did that earlier. But effectively, there's a migration shell script that wraps a bunch of drush commands and let this run. So what this is doing behind the scenes here is just running a bunch of drush commands. It will log the output. Once it's complete, it'll also grab all the messages and throw them into JSON files so they're easier to parse. One thing that the keen eye among you might see is that we do support multi-threading. It's not enabled for this. It's a fairly like bleeding edge feature that we've rolled out for our giant migration, but I'd say it's very much in a beta state in its current form. So this is just running in the background. What you'll see here now is, hey, it ran. This output here is the migrate status output. So, it generated and imported our 11 nodes that I said. It had 29 things it didn't process, which would be the content models. So, once it was complete, it dumped out logs for us. So we kind of have like an import log, which is the actual output of all those commands, which you kind of see like this is your normal Drupal migrate looking kind of output, which is whatever. It's useful in some scenarios. The kind of meat of what's in here as well, like a not typo, is all the messages tables for each individual migration are dumped into JSON in a nice readable way. So say for the nodes migration, we kind of see that, cat's not a good look for this. One sec. So you can kind of see that like a bunch of things weren't processed and we logged accordingly. So these are all content model objects that didn't get ingested. So we just skip them. But for completeness sake, we're logging. So if someone comes through and they're like, well, where is this object? They can kind of have an idea. So looking at this now within our actual browser, if I refresh this now, hopefully we should see 11 content nodes. Hooray, we have 11 content nodes. One thing that we're able to do, because we are mapping field PID, is we have a router written that you can use to map your old Islandora object PIDs into the browser, into Drupal rather, and it'll redirect to the representation in Drupal 9. That's in the process of being contributed back, but it's something that, yeah, is doable. So I have my cookie monster collection with my various different types of cookie monsters, obviously a book, a compound, my PDF, and my 2 images. You can kind of see like when we map this, this is faceting on the subject topic. So if we were to actually like look at this, the original mods record for this had like, painting Bob Ross Cookie Monsters. It didn't create a new term every time you encountered it. It just made it once and then referenced just that term again. Yeah, so I think that's kind of it for the demo portion. There is one last thing to show off with this. So I did kind of mention this earlier. Because the FOXML module exists, it defines itself as a streaming wrapper. So if you want to, you can totally point to old PIDs like so and treat them as files. So in this case, I have my cookie 1 from the old system. And if I do a file get contents on that, it will load up the entire FOXML. La-di-da. And then the other thing with that as well, before I forget, just click on a random object here. If we go look at the media for this as part of the migration, so we have our original file, which was a PNG, and the derivatives and so on. But because of the way the migration was defined, we're storing the original FOXML here as well. So if we go actually click on this media, you can kind of see that, oh, another window, it's the original FOXML as well. So that's there for historical sake and if we need to use it later. So going back to my slide deck. So future improvements. I know I just dumped a lot of technical weed stuff at you, but it does represent quite a bit of development time at DGI. So we're working on reducing the processing time by reworking how media and data streams are migrated. So in that example, there's kind of like one migration per rather for the original file as well as the original media. If you were, as you start to kind of want to preserve more and more data streams, like say you have handwritten full texts and things like that, you want to move over in that kind of paradigm, you'd have to keep adding additional migrations, which makes your migrations that need to be processed grow by a factor of 1 times your amount of objects. So that's not ideal. So we've implemented something for our current very large client that we're hopefully going to roll back into our upstream normal DGI Migrate. There's going to be additional iteration on the multi-threaded processing improvements. So right now we have the ability to spawn up as many workers as we want to process a queue of things to be migrated, which is really, really important. So like for throughput wise, doing the Drupal migrate in a single thread isn't great, given that it's mostly just database hits. Like you can really, really scale this. So we have that implemented. We're using it currently for this very large client, but there will be some more iteration on making that better. The other thing that we're doing as well is pointing at the binary content directly, as opposed to copying and recreating files within Drupal. So for that large client of ours, it represents terabytes and terabytes worth of data, and copying and recreating files within Drupal is a very expensive process when you're talking about scale of that size. So for them, we're actually just reusing the original Akubra structure because we already have those files. Genericizing the Islandora object route that I kind of showed off there. And we've kind of prototyped, started talking about a way to leverage that Akubra adapter work to have a way for people to be able to view the old legacy content within Drupal. So lastly, before I open up for questions, we'll talk really quickly about tuning Drupal for migrations. And this can apply outside of Drupal Migrate. This is just kind of like things that we've encountered and ran into. So things that you should know is, regardless of what you're using to migrate, whether it's JSON API, Drupal Migrate, Islandora Workbench, whatever, the PHP thread is blocking whenever an entity is CRUDed. So for example, if you're doing path aliasing, it's going to do a lookup after every time it ingests the entity, and that becomes slower and slower over time. Another example would be if you're leveraging REST OAI PMH and you have a caching strategy such that it's looking to kind of invalidate every time something changes, it can become very, very memory heavy, as well as it slows down process itself. So, big sets overrides, which is a submodule, was kind of spawned out of that, which just kind of disables some config during the migration process, with the intent that once you're done, you kind of, remove those overrides, reindex your Solr, generate your path aliasing, but doing it after the fact. So your actual long running migrations themselves aren't slowed down. In that same vein, it also consumes additional memory on top of the request, and that can balloon over time depending on how your migration is running. So, for example, if you have your Solr configured to index immediately, its normal default behavior is that it operates with what's called a shutdown handler. So, right before a PHP thread dies, it'll say, okay, let me go index everything that I'm aware of. Well, that doesn't work well if you're in doing Drupal batches and it says, hey, I've exhausted my memory, and Solr is like, now I'm going to go consume a bunch of memory. So, we've identified a lot of scenarios where this was hitting us. We got into doing like memory profiling and XH profing to make sure that like we're narrowing these things down as best as we can, because like the economies of scale, when you're talking about processing so many objects, every little bit starts to really add up. I can talk for a long time about this. I won't continue any more on this topic during this presentation, at least. And then lastly, migrations can be hard. So reach out to the mailing lists, reach out in Slack. There's a few channels that Jess had highlighted in her earlier kind of slide deck. And I'm not going to shill for my company in particular, but there's also vendors in the space that have dealt with a lot of this. So feel free to reach out as you see fit. So I know that was a very long presentation. There was lots of content presented, but if you have any questions, feel free. And I see there's probably some in the chat. Oh, Alexander making jokes. Yes, any questions? Well, that's similar vein, Alexander. One thing that we do in our standard kind of migration process is we do actually run an XLT, which allows us to clean up data like at an intermediary level before but we migrate things, just because for some scenarios maybe it's an involved process to go back to the original data and do it, things like that.
Thank you so much, Jordan. This was incredibly informative and detailed in the hows of using these tools and these approaches. I'll leave it here for if there's any more questions that come up. This is also being recorded as we've been doing with these sessions, so it'll be cleaned up and shared. Got your hello@discoverygarden.ca email here. If folks want to reach out to you to questions, I know they can also find you on Slack and other spaces.
Yep.
Well, again, thank you.